During the break, one of the things that we discussed is that, and I don't, but not all the board members heard this. If you've got questions that you'd like for Peter or some of the others to think about and come back with answers tomorrow, or at sometime in the future, it's perfectly okay to write those questions down, and we can give those to Peter. And he or some of the people on this panel will be around for the entire 2 day. There'll be someone here from this panel during the entire time, and so there will be opportunities on the part of the board. If you want to ask this invited, what did we end up calling these folks? That was a huge discussion as to what you should be called. Invited expert panel. You can ask them to comment on things that you're hearing as well. But so that we can be a little bit orderly here and get through this fairly quickly, why don't I start with Felicia and then Tam and Steve and then myself if I have any additional questions. Let's just move through and see if there's some questions that you have.
Thanks, and I'm sure I'll have some at the end of the day and tomorrow. And this is I think, a very thoughtful process that's been put together. I want to thank the staff first for putting together this kind of a lengthy process over the course of the next number of weeks and months. And I particularly want to thank Dr. Goodwin for setting up the expert panel as well as doing it for the subsequent workshops. I'm delighted to have you do that, and I'm particularly delighted that you invited back Dr. Dom, who was my mentor for these last couple of years, and I have had the benefit by virtue of the Delta Stewardship Council hearing process to have had a preview of much of this over the past couple of years, and I really do appreciate it. A couple of questions just popped to mind through the course of the presentations, which were all really excellent, and each one of them is worthy of a day, but we won't be able to do that. But I'm glad you'll all be available, I know, over the coming weeks to answer questions. I know that these are hearings about the impact of salinity in particular, and we're starting there in this, but a couple of things were either explicit or implicit in some of the things that many of you said, and I just appreciate anybody commenting on it in a more granular or even in terms of suggestions to us as we consider how to frame our work. One is the undeniable impact of climate change. Yeah, how do we take that into account in what we're trying to do? And what is our time frame? Just as many dialogues, I'll use the word dialogue as a more gracious word to use, about the Delta really talk past each other. It's as someone said in the 90s, maybe Bruce will remember who it was, said, your frame on Delta flow, ecosystem, and other issues really depends on when you think history begins. And it is a completely different conversation, completely genuine and heartfelt, depending on when you think the baseline is. And in this case, we're not going back to the 1850s, but the question as we look at climate, the impacts of climate, how should we be adjusting how we think about, in practical terms, what it is we need to be coming up with? And the second, and in some ways related and in some ways parallel question, is a notion that Dr. Dom has talked about quite a bit in the course of the Delta Plan deliberations, and I know that folks at the State Board have been thinking about it as well, is how do we deal with flow in the context of multiple stressors, some of which are influenced by flow and some of which aren't. How should we be taking that into account? I know we're talking salinity here, but it does have an impact on stressors. I'd love your thoughts on that, even, not this is what you should do exactly, but what we ought to be thinking about beyond the process, which is very important, but particular things. And then finally, one other thing to put out there, these are my three, is something else that the Delta Council has grappled with, and people talk about it using different words, and the words sometimes scare people as if they hear it as their worst fear. People do hear what they fear first, and then maybe hear what you mean second, but figuring out how to be clear with what you mean is an art form in addition to a science, and that is the issue of mimicking the natural flows. You know, in some ways that may mean, as Dr. Dom was saying, you know, you have a first flow because that's going to move your nutrients, or it's going to be when the fish need to move, or it's going to move sediments, whatever it is, at a particular place in geography, a particular point in time. And any of your insights into how we can integrate that into our thinking would also be helpful.
Why don't we go ahead and get all our questions out there, and then you answer some now and some later. I mean, you can pick and choose how you want to do this. So, Steve, you want to go next? And
well, that case study that was thrust upon us with the flash studies was an enlightening experience, and you know, as I heard the suggestions on how to set up institutional infrastructure, you know, to accomplish that, you know, that's going to be a collaborative exercise. That's going to be working, you know, with DWR, BUREC, but also, you know, all the other water rights interests that feed into the Delta. That's a major undertaking. So I appreciate Dr. Claren's suggestion to use the Delta Science Program. But you know, really to pull something like that off without having Mother Nature sort of make it happen, and having court decisions holding up whether something's going to be, data is going to be collected. Well, California's not going to accomplish this thing if we go about it that way. You know, we do have to be committed, and through this collaborative structure, to have an institutional infrastructure to accomplish adaptive management. Otherwise, everybody's, you know, trying to, almost panic mode, trying to get that all set up in contracts and everything. But, you know, fortunately there was information collected. I think what I'm hoping is that shows that we collect the information, we don't run and leap to conclusions about, you know, correlations, but we're committed to using that information in a management context. You know, there has been a lot learned in the last couple of years, last 10 years, about you know, how, you know, things like the ocean patterns, the climate change can affect things. So we have to, in our Bay Delta planning, we can encourage the collaboration. You know, we can recognize that through the State Water Board's funding mechanisms, what little we have, but we can encourage those processes. And so, you know, I encourage staff to sort of build on existing Bay Delta plan language in terms of those commitments. So, you know, I appreciate the input on how we can structure, you know, data collection. You know, let's see, one of my questions. I see a lot of, you know, interlaced stresses on the system that Dr. Fleener really highlighted. And, you know, what I struggle with is, well, what can the water board system do to maybe not necessarily, I mean, there's the regulatory issues we're talking about here, but also what related regulatory programs can we modify in the Bay Delta plan to encourage work toward addressing stressors other than flow. So, you know, I was wondering, maybe from the science panel, but also other stakeholders in this process, is, you know, how can we structure the Bay Delta plan to encourage sort of those relationships that are highlighted between water and land management. So, you know, the ecosystem function restoration, you know, because we can all talk about what needs to happen, but we know, you know, there's a lot of steps to get to a point where we really have, you know, a BDCP type, you know, habitat restoration plan. So I would encourage input on how the water board, and that's my question too, is how can we better structure our regulatory program, you know, through authorities such as 401 and other things to, you know, not sort of get in the way of habitat restoration that can, you know, also benefit the ecosystem besides the flow management that's fairly highlighted here. So that's one major question I have.
Actually, one area that I wanted to follow up on, I did with Cliff during the break, and that is I'd love for you to share some of the write-ups and studies that have been done on how Australia and South America and other places have addressed this issue, and always look towards lessons learned from others so that we can hopefully replicate any successes and avoid any failures. I think a general question for all of you, either for today or sometime in the next few weeks or months. We've heard today that flows matter. I think we all know that. Flow matters to all of us in one way, shape, or form. But flows come with costs associated with it. And one of the challenges we have is in this balancing decision. And obviously we've met and heard from various stakeholders, all with different perspective and inputs, and all seeking to guide us on that balancing decision. But I am curious from the panel of scientific experts, I guess maybe I shouldn't use that because everyone who talks today are scientific experts. I'm curious if you have any suggestions, anything to offer from a scientific perspective in terms of this balancing decision and what actions we might take, whether it be on flows, on invasive species, on habitats, on whatever, where there is some measure of scientific certainty that that action would result in some improvements that we're all, I think, pretty much desperately hoping to affect with the decisions that we make and with the actions that we undertake. See, that was just a simple little request, simple little question. Take your time.
And I will add three comments. One, and this is addressed to staff. Are you providing to Peter and to the science to the Delta Science program questions that you need answered in order to do in order to advise us as to what we should be doing, and if not, is there something that we can do to help make that happen? Because I think in terms of creating a stronger link between policy and science, you're going to need to feel able to do that, and vice versa. And so, if there are things that we should be able to should be doing, or if there are other agencies that should be doing things, let us know. That's one question to staff. Also, to the science panel, we will be needing some triggers. We will be needing some point when we are going to be shifting from X to Y or X2 to X1. We need something that says things have changed so dramatically. You really are going to have to be moving from here to here. What are those triggers? Will it be sustained temperature or salinity or something over a 10-year period? Is that a trigger? Or is 10 years too short? Or do we have to have 50 years? So, am I asking for something that's impossible to do? And if I am, that's fine. But if there are some triggers that we could be thinking about that would tell us kind of where we are. We have used wet year, dry year, et cetera, in the past as triggers. What else should we be using? And the third is I'm going to. Some of you are making some assumptions about wastewater plants. For example, both Felicia and I, our ears perked up when you mentioned that there would be an ever increasing amount of wastewater coming out from, I assume, population growth. That's not necessarily true, and in fact, so be careful about your assumptions on some things that you may not know a whole lot about, um, because we're sewage girls, and we yeah, actually we're sewage group, boys and girls, and in fact we're finding concentrations are changing, but some of those concentrations are getting used for energy production. So there are some possibilities that how things have been in the past will not be the same in the future, particularly where there are man-made structures that are producing these things that you're assuming. The same would be true in terms of how, what people are using for water. Sometimes they're using wet water, sometimes they're using conservation. So there are just a lot of assumptions. You just cannot assume that the way we've used water in the past is the way we're going to be using water in the future, or the kinds of water we have in the past, or the kinds of water we'll have in the future. So I just want to put that caution out there, and I'll encourage some thinking on that. So those are questions from all of us. Of course, Charlie's going to have lots more questions when he gets back. So you can decide how you want to handle this, Peter, now, or some pieces of this now or later.
Well, Chair, we'll defer to our esteemed facilitator here. Would you like me just to give a
Well, I
brief
think
overview?
I
and
think
then-
you guys could take up to 10 minutes right now. I've heard from the other panels that they don't need their full allotment of time, so if you want to take 10 minutes now, that would be great.
Okay, so what I would suggest perhaps is a procedure. First of all, my role here is just to facilitate, introduce the panel. So you're not hearing from the Delta Science program right now. We're just trying to get the folks together. But what I would like to say in response to many of those questions, the reason we were so interested to support this series of workshops is that we are tasked, as Ms. Marcus knows, with developing the science plan for the Delta Stewardship Council, and we are committed to not having that as a process that's done in a vacuum. So this was for us in the science program a great opportunity to reach out, talk to many of the scientists right across the spectrum to help us scope what this science plan should look like, and then we're tasked with putting that together in a date. So just for some of the questions here, yes, as part of this, we've pretty much completed a survey of science plans that are used to inform policy, not only in the US and elsewhere. So Lindsay Correa has done a great job in opening those doors, and that process was really started while Cliff was still here. So yes, there's a lot of information that you're very welcome to have access to. We're also very interested to get your thoughts, and of course your staff's thoughts, about how this science plan can really be the most effective. You know, we don't want it to sit on a shelf or to be on a web page somewhere, and it's one of multiple efforts that could potentially be conflicting. So that's looking at
What's the time frame for that plan?
currently, the full plan is due at the end of next year, but we are in the process of rolling out. In fact, we're just working on this process right now. So we want to have a sort of a rolling series of outputs from the process. And so there's questions when everybody is so busy. How do you really engage with the best minds that are working not just local here in California, but across the country? Another question is, as you are very well aware of, you're here in California, you have on many of the rankings 10 of the top universities in the world, period. The knock-on effect into the agencies, so here I'm speaking as an outsider, you look at the staff that populate the agencies here, the people in the private sectors, there truly isn't a science community working for all sides of the same caliber that you're managing here. So the real question is, how can you corral this incredible depth of expertise to, you as our colleague Chris Enright says, you to put it into actionable research, actionable science. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I did want to let you know that's ongoing. And what I would suggest in probably the 6 or 7 minutes we've got now, while we have the members here, maybe we could just go down the road, and then if there's questions that you would like to respond to from what you heard, we've listed all of your questions here, and we will obviously come back with responses down the road. But while we have everybody here and with an audience, I would suggest we run down, perhaps starting with Bruce, and again, my apologies, Bruce, this time. And then if there are any of those big questions and very good questions that were raised, if you would like to respond, that would be great.
I would like to respond to this idea of triggers, and there were several things that came to my mind. And I love Jim's ideas of adaptation and anticipation. And one of the examples of a trigger, and I hesitate to speak to the sewage girls, but you know, it's going to be 13 years before we solve the ammonia problem. So we need to protect those resources in the meantime. That should, I think, enter into the balancing between how you solve that problem. In 13 years, the problem will be redefined. But in the meantime, we have perhaps a problem. On the other hand, we have some planning issues going forward. And if you're going to build wetlands, it's really, really nice to know how salty they're going to be for how long, and that's a factor of climate change and you guys. So to try to do wetland restoration in the Western Delta or Suisun Marsh without firm understanding of what you guys are going to do is building kind of castles in the sand, to my mind. It's just like, what's the summertime salinity going to be? Tell us, in dry years. You know, that will be important. And nobody knows that right now because you haven't done that yet. So I think there's an urgent need for you to help contribute to that. Similarly, on everything else that is a standard that is affected by flow, and it's a pretty short list of things that we're concerned about that aren't affected by flow. Once we know what the flow standards will be from the San Joaquin through the Delta, et cetera, that will make setting some of the concentrations and loads, fates and transports of contaminants a lot easier to deal with. And without that knowledge, you have to take a much broader view of, well, it could be this and it could be that, so we better make the safest assumption, and that starts getting at a very expensive protection level. So I think that your guys' job is to make everybody else more efficient. So that's one thing. And then on the other, anticipation, so there's some things we can anticipate. And those are things, permits and wetland restoration and the rest of that are things we want to do. But there are things that are going to happen that we know are going to happen that we don't want to do. We're going to have catastrophes. And getting to Stephen's question, once you have more than X hectares of the Western Delta Islands lost to flooding, protecting the beneficial uses of the Delta are going to be really, really differently done. And so we can do that. We have models that would start saying, yeah, salinities will change by this much when you lose this many hectares or these islands. Some of that's already been done. Can set those kind of anticipated conditions up, and when they happen, then we need to adopt some other way of protecting those beneficial uses, and I think give up on some of the less effective tools when you change the physical structure again. Similarly, we've been doing a pretty good job with climate change of anticipating what that's going to do. That can be built in, but it's slower and more likely the floods rather than the sea level rise or something to be dealt with in our lifetimes, I hope. But lastly, I will go on my last soapbox, quagga are going to be here. Quagga are going to have a huge impact. We saw huge impacts in Denmark when new clams came in. We saw impacts, as Wim described, of Potamocorbula when it came in. Back in the 50s, we saw the huge impacts of corbicula when it came in. And we have data from elsewhere that tell us what some of those impacts are going to be, what a lot of those impacts are going to be. For the life of me, I cannot find anybody planning to do that. Contra Costa Water District, whom I respect to the highest degree, has put in a new fish screen, one fish screen, and I fear what it's going to look like when quagga get here. And without a second one beside it, I don't know how they're going to clean it and still be screening the water. That kind of planning needs to be built in to your guys' work, I think. And those are some of the triggers that I would look for. Once we lose islands, once we have quagga, anticipatable issues, those are the triggers. And it will require more active management than the kind of sit back and let it see what happens over 20 years. Because they're all going to happen by 20 years from now. Thank you.
Five items, briefly. And I'm not sure exactly how I got to these responses, but they came up in the questions you were asking. So if you hear something that sounds familiar, then you can just take it as an answer. The coastal ocean is coming to the estuary. And by that I mean, and the reason we know that is that Yolo County occurrences of marine and brackish plant and animal species are occurring for the first time on record and are likely to continue through time. So I think that's a reality that the board is going to have to consider. Number two, what I know as synthetic science should be and has been talked about today as a priority is a priority, but it's not clear to me, I don't think it's clear to us exactly how to do this, nor has there been an indication that available resources, and by that I mean specifically money and personnel, are up to the task of the synthetic science that we're all grasping for here today. The recommendation for doing this kind of science includes training people, hiring employees, and paying for their services, and I think most importantly, and this may be the role of the Delta Science Program, directing their activities. Number three, regional ecological management will need to be considered as we reformulate our water quality standards. I think this is something that we just have to give back to the board. For example, will the Delta and Suisun Bay and Marsh be allowed to become more or less saline as climate change effects manifest within the estuary? Is tidal marsh recovery consistent with other beneficial uses as a management objective when those objectives have Delta water quality or water flow recommendations? I think that's the mandate of the board to decide. Number four, subject matter related questions for the scientific community will be necessary to begin the learning process. I think they need to come from the board for us to respond to. What are your objectives? Science can help you answer questions, we can help you formulate questions, but ultimately I think they have to come from you. What do you need help answering? And lastly, and this is something I've been struggling with over the weeks that we've been trying to put this subject matter together, how do we get scientists into the meetings and policymaker discussions that you have every day? It seems like we farm this stuff out to scientists and modelers, and then on a somewhat periodic basis we go back and we say, what have you got for us? I think that's missing the point. I think we need to have the modelers and scientists in the room with the policymakers so they can be answering questions as you go along. That's learning. The other thing is just, I don't know, lecturing. That's it for me.
Okay, and actually, perhaps I could cut in here because I think this is going to take a lot longer than we anticipated, and we do want to keep Fish and Game still talking to us. So, but what I would like to do, just to wrap it up, we haven't heard from Dr. Brown, and certainly we heard your questions. Everyone here, obviously, on the panel has a lot to contribute, so we will respond to those questions. But Dr. Brown, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say anything while you're here.
Well, I usually don't like to talk in these sorts of things, but I mean, I really just want to echo Steve's comments because, this whole topic of science support for policy development is something that we talk about amongst ourselves all the time. And I think the issue is exactly what he emphasized, that, it takes people, it takes funding, it takes time. And that's obviously not necessarily all on you guys because there are other agencies and policy groups concerned with the Delta, and I guess this is sort of Peter's job. But, you see before you a group of people that get to ask to do this sort of thing over and over again, and we need new people that are equipped to answer your questions, perhaps on a more full-time basis. We are all very busy every day of the year with the other things we're supposed to be doing. So I think, to really get to the strengthening these connections that Jim talked about is really going to take something new. And it's not all on you, it's on all of the agencies involved with managing the Delta. And, how you talk about a wicked problem, getting everybody together and deciding how that's going to happen is dealing with people, and dealing with people is a really wicked problem. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks very much. And I understand that you guys, or at least as many of you as possible, are going to be around today and tomorrow, and so maybe they'll be available also at the end of tomorrow to continue answering your questions. So the next group up is the regulatory and fishery agencies. And so I think the first person we're going to hear from is Fish and Game. So clear up your gum wrappers and things like this as you leave. Take all your trash with you. All right. Go. Did one of you guys take the mouse with you? No. Okay.
And then I think
All right. All right, good.
there's a title slide if you don't mind going back a couple. There we go. Here we go. Okay, we're going to get started. This is the Regulatory and Fishery Agency panel, and I drew the short straw, so I'm introducing everyone here this morning. I'll start with myself. My name's Erin Forsman. I'm an environmental scientist on staff at US EPA Region 9. I'm on their Bay Delta team with Bruce in the Water Division. And with me here on the panel, I'll start with Pat Colston. He's an environmental scientist with California Department of Fish and Game, and he's been working on Delta issues since 1978. On my right-hand side here is Matt Nobriga. He's a fish biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with 21 years of experience working in the Delta and fisheries issues. And then there's John Shelton, who's on the other side of him, who's an environmental scientist working for California Department of Fish and Game. And he's been working on fisheries and watershed issues for 20 years. So we worked together to produce this slideshow presentation, but each agency is going to present their own section, and that section is very consistent with their roles and responsibilities. And with that, CDFG is going to go first, Pat followed by John, then Matt, and then I'll go. So we'll find maybe a lunch break in there, maybe after CDFG, something like that. Okay. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, so you roll it.
You roll it to do the
Yeah.
pages. And you push one of these to get a cursor.
Okay. You can just move it around. Oh, I don't know how you get the cursor. You have to use the hand. So you can press that. Yeah. So you just have to use the hand as the pointer.
Okay. Excuse me. Good morning. Good morning. Those of us working on Bay Delta issues at the Department of Fish and Game want to thank you for this opportunity to provide input at this early informal stage of the plan, review, and update process. We expect this fall's series of workshops to provide identify a tremendous amount of information to support the process. Indeed, these workshops, as you've seen this morning, coincide with a period of tremendous scientific information generation. As you know, we have provided already substantial input to the process through our 2010 quantifiable objectives and flow criteria report that was prepared in connection with the Delta Reform Act. The subject of this workshop is the low salinity zone. Given our role as the Fisheries Management Agency for California and our responsibilities under the California Endangered Species Act, our particular interest in the condition of the low salinity zone relates to the smelt species listed under CISA, Delta smelt and Longfin smelt. Excuse me. Both species, but especially Delta smelt, are highly dependent on the condition of the low salinity zone. My presentation this morning will be brief, about 15 minutes total. I will use this time to highlight several issues regarding the relationship between the low salinity zone and the smelt species, that we're going to be focused on as this process advances. We believe this process will be highly consequential for the smelt species. Greater data, my talk does not have a lot of data slides or graphics. Greater detail on presented issues can be found in our written submittal for this workshop, our planned contributions to Workshop 2, and even today's presentations by fellow panelists here, Aaron and Matt, will provide some supporting information. So there's 6 key points I want to make today. First, we want to convey our belief that delta smelt and longfin smelt are truly at risk in this system right now. It is quite easy for us to imagine without more protective management of the system that the delta smelt as a species could be lost and the Bay Delta population of longfin smelt could be extirpated from the system. We have also concluded that the increasing impairment of delta outflow threatens longfin smelt viability. Similarly, it is apparent that the generally decreasing extent and quality of the low salinity zone, fall low salinity zone habitat threatens delta smelt viability. We also want to emphasize that despite many ecological perturbations in the low salinity zone, the low salinity zone and the key species there still respond positively to delta outflow. Most importantly, as we state in our flow criteria report, it's apparent to us that the present plan objectives are insufficiently protective of the smelt species. Finally, we suggest that the response of the system to robust flow conditions in 2011 exhibits the potential of improved plan objectives. I wanted to point out that there have been 4 significant listing actions since 2006. In January 2010, delta smelt were uplisted from threatened to endangered under CISA. In April 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that delta smelt warranted endangered species status. In April 2010, longfin smelt were listed as threatened under CISA. And finally, in April 2012, the Fish and Wildlife Service determined that the longfin smelt Bay Delta distinct population segment warranted listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act. We find significance in these 4 actions. We think they represent a heightened concern regarding species viability and the need for increased protection. Also, the documents associated with these 4 actions are rich sources of information, well-synthesized information on the biology and status of the species. And finally, we don't believe that the information generated in these ESA processes has been fully incorporated into the boards and the Fish and Game's flow documents yet. So that stuff is out there for us. I'm sure that most everyone in this room has seen this graph in one form or another. In fact, we saw it in a slightly different form earlier today. So this is the abundance trend of longfin smelt in the system based on indices derived from the Fall Midwater Trawl Survey running from 1967 through 2011. And so what you see there is a lot of interannual variation, a lot of it flow related, but a steady decline over time. And the decline that you see here is actually more severe than it looks right off the bat, because a lot of the bars on the left-hand side of the graph have been truncated. So you have values on the left-hand side of 80,000, which compare to, for example, the 1995 bar, which is 8,000. So you have a 10-fold change right there that we're not even showing very well. The bars appear different on the right and left-hand side of the graph because in 1990, the Fall Midwater Trawl Survey started distinguishing between age classes. But most of the fish in all cases there are young of the year fish. The new information on this graph is the fall indices of 477 in 2011. the best production since the last wet year, 2006. So some points we'd like to make about Longfin Smelt. For the reasons listed here, we believe that the current Bay Delta plan is insufficiently protective of Longfin Smelt. First, Longfin Smelt has historically responded and continues to respond strongly and positive to winter-spring outflow, particularly spring flows. The flow response has changed in amplitude over time, but in a relative sense has remained strong. Second, the impairment of spring flows, particularly March through May, has been substantial in recent past, ranging from 6 to 82% and averaging 56% during the 1982 through 2003 period. So we really have had a substantial impairment of flows already. These first 2 points lead to the obvious conclusion that current levels of outflow impairment likely substantially limit Longfin Smelt and perhaps Longfin Smelt prey production in many years. As noted in our flow criteria report, current plan objectives allow for very high levels of outflow impairment. It is now the case that annual Longfin Smelt production levels are fluctuating at very low levels with flow, and the population seldom experiences cohort over cohort population growth, arguably threatening their viability. Finally, we wanted to note that there was a modest positive flow response in 2011. So another graph you've seen in some form. This is the population trend for Delta Smelt, again based on indices derived from the Fall Midwater Trawl Survey extending from 1967 through 2011. Again, you see a lot of interannual variation, not quite as much as you see in the Longfin Smelt graph, but a lot of variation. But still, you see a pretty strong declining trend over time. And this graph has on it these red bars that you see, and they represent instances of record low indices. So, for example, in 1969, that was the lowest. That was lower than any of the indices that preceded it. And as you can see, as you go from left to right across the graph, the frequency of these record low indices are increasing. And we got to the point where in 2004, 2005, 2008, and 2009, we had record low indices. So that's a cause for concern. So with respect to Delta Smelt, for the reasons listed there, we believe that providing good fall habitat is necessary for Delta Smelt viability. Delta Smelt live primarily within the low salinity zone and slightly above. They really are a low salinity zone species. The fall indices of abundance have recently been on the order of 10% of what they were in the previous 30 years. And as I mentioned a minute ago, we have this increased frequency of record low indices. We think a great case has been made, particularly in the 2008 OCAP biological opinion that Fish and Wildlife Service wrote, that fall low salinity zone position does affect cohort survival. And there have been striking detrimental trends in this X2 position, and thus the low salinity zone extent and condition. The current Bay Delta plan does not guard against these high X2 values, irrespective of water year type. And we did want to say that there was an encouraging bump in fall 2011 abundance index. Oops. I wanted to dwell for a minute on this question of the trend in fall X2. This graph is adapted from a graph that Fred Firer had in his testimony in September of 2011 in the litigation down in Fresno over the Delta Smelt biological opinion RPA. And it's always been an eye-popper to me since the first time I saw it. You know, what it shows clearly is that fall X2 is rising higher in the system over time, and that this effect is most pronounced for wet and above normal years. And what you see after the year 2000 is that X2 is pinned up high in the system, completely irrespective of water year type. And this is a huge change in the system. I lost a bullet, or I lost a dot. I had placed a dot at about 75 kilometers to represent 2011. It was on the right-hand side there, sort of just above where that arrow is now. But you can see that we got this condition in 2011 where the fall position of X2 dropped down to levels similar to what we would have seen 10, 15 years ago, not as low as we saw 20 or 30 years ago, but still greatly improved. This slide explores the relationship between the position of fall X2 and delta smelt recruitment. So the upper part of this slide obviously is the graph you just saw, and I'll point out now that I've labeled 2006, which is the blue dot there, and then 2010, which is the yellow dot, and again, just above that arrow point, there would have been a dot for 2011. So what I have on the lower part of the slide is what I called recruitment progressions, which is quite simply the fall midwater trawl in 1 year, followed by the 20 millimeter indices in the next year, and then again in the next year, the fall midwater trawl indices. And I have two strings there of numbers. One is a 2-year string from 2009 to 2011, and the other is a 1-year string from 2005 to 2006. And just to orient you, those two number 29s that are above each other, above and below each other, are the fall midwater trawl index for 2010. And the punchline here is the number 343. That's the index we got for delta smelt in fall of 2011. And it was preceded by a 20 millimeter index of 8. And you can see in 2010 we had a lower 20 millimeter index, but a much lower fall midwater trawl index, suggesting that change in the position of X2 in the fall may have had a pretty strong effect. I put 2005 and 2006 on there because in the spring of 2006, the 20 millimeter survey was 9.9, very similar to what it was in 2011, but we didn't get the strong response between there and the fall midwater trawl survey. So the fall midwater trawl survey index is 41, which is not a very strong number. And if you look up at the graph, you can see that 2006, the fall X2 position was way up there. So, this is, I admit, this is completely anecdotal, but it's part of our thinking going into this process. I think it's what people would have predicted based on conceptual models and so forth. It's obviously the flash investigations will be looking into this in much greater detail, and we'll learn more about it. But I thought it was worth noting today. So thank you for that. I'm not going to go over the mechanics of this slide. Just let me say that the index in Longfin smelt abundance that we got in the fall of 2011 was an increase, but it wasn't that great. Certainly not as great as 2006, and so that's kind of disappointing. But what I see in this is that the parental cohorts for 2011 were very low. So in 2007, you had a record low young of the year cohort, and in 2009, you had one of the lowest years on record. And those were the parents and grandparents of the cohort that we're measuring in 2011. So what this says is when you're looking at these indices, you really have to take into account this parental stock. And the other thing it suggests to me is that we need to get more robust flow years, or we're not going to get the cohort over cohort growth in population that we need. The public notice for the workshops talks a lot about identifying additional information. This is not a comprehensive list, but it's a list of things I'm familiar with that I think are particularly useful. I mentioned the ESA documents. I wanted to mention the ongoing production of indices and data from the IEP. There was a lot of discussion today about this great adaptive management plan that's been undertaken for in associated flash studies. And then I wanted to say that we've had a lot of independent science reviews in regard to a lot of the work, the scientific work that's going on. And I think those are particularly great places to find clear-eyed assessments of uncertainty, both in conclusions and in methods. So I look to those a lot. And then with these pending things, as you know, these flash study results are going to come out in 2013. And I also wanted to mention that BDCP is producing a tremendous amount of information, analysis, articulation of conceptual models, both for species and for conservation measures. And that's something to always be looking towards. So thank you very much.
So do we have time here for the other Fish and Game person, a speaker? Yeah, let's go then. Okay, great.
So my name is John Shelton from Department of Fish and Game, and I want to thank the Vice Chair and the board members for having us today. And actually, my job today is relatively easy because, one, the invited panel covered quite a bit of this, and also the things I'm covering, I think you guys have heard a lot about in the past. I'm covering adaptive management and some of the ways we should be looking at climate change issues. And for adaptive management, I think that's one of the things that now is pretty much a given, is that what we need to do. But I do want to go into maybe give a little different viewpoint of why we look at look at doing adaptive management, and it's mainly because it's a complex system. And then I also want to just point out again that the adaptive management model is well vetted, and I think Cliff Dahm, reported that it's from around the world. It's not just this area that's well vetted. And then one of the things I wanted to point out is where we are in that adaptive management model, and then what we need out of the water quality control plan on the update. And with the climate change, I'm not going to get into a lot of it other than to try and frame it on what kind of stages we're at and where we are at in those stages. So first off, we all know that the Delta is a very complex system, both ecologically and socially. I mean, the things we get out of it, what we do to it is as complex as the ecosystem things are. One of the things we do, we as society, is we tend to try to put together an image of something, a simple relationship, and a lot of times we think of linear relationships. In most instances, ecological systems actually have non-linear relationships. If I can get my, oops, where'd it go? Which is the hand? Oh, I found it. So in looking at this line through here is an equilibrium line. So the x-axis is conditions, the y-axis is ecosystem state. So if a condition is down in here, I mean, if condition is this part on the x-axis, you should have a system that tends towards a state that gets up here. So the push is in this direction, that's what the arrow represents, and the arrow's up here, again, the state would come down to this area. And an example of this, and there's lots of these that are out there, but an example, just to kind of make it simple, is the idea on water clarity and nutrient input into a small pond. All right, if you have very low input of nutrients, probably you're going to have very high clarity. You're not eutrophic at that point. So for folks who work with sewage systems and other stuff, yeah, this is something I think that fits in that stuff. On the other hand, if you have very high nutrients, you're probably going to have very low transparency, right? Lots of algae growing and other things. Again, this system is usually displayed somewhat linearly, but we all know that there's actually some complexity to it, and it can actually change as the system change. And that's a change beyond the numbers you're representing. So with that kind of clarity and nutrient input, if you think of temperature, as the temperature goes up, the ability for phytoplankton to bloom goes up. So you actually change at lower input levels of nutrients. So you actually get a system that starts changing its equilibrium line, and it even becomes more complex. Right? The reason why I talk about this is it adds in this idea of what goes on with tipping points And we hear those numbers a lot, and we hear the idea about tipping points a lot, but there are actually conceptual models that shows how this happens and why it happens. So if we keep pushing that line, you get to a point, this is still the equilibrium line, it actually folds back on itself. So again, you have equilibria, you know, that would be here or would be here, but if you have a condition, a certain amount of nutrient input, for the example, you can actually have 3 different equilibrium points. But what you find out is that this equilibrium point right here is very unstable. Any sort of push to the system, cold night or a warm night, a windy day, something like that, will push it off this equilibrium line. And if it pushes it above, you can go up. If it pushes it down, it goes down. So it's unstable in this area. But what it really means is you have this point here where you change from this line and you drop down to a line down below. Now, the other part of this issue is what they call hysteresis. And that's the idea that as you change conditions, you can actually be in a system where once you've tipped over into here, to go back, to make that system clear again for the example we're using, you actually have to put in less nutrients than you were putting in to tip it over here. So you can tip it at one level, but in order to tip it back, you've got to go to a lower level. And that's part of the idea with complexity, is that you run into this hysteresis on several different factors. All right. The other thing that I wanted to throw in here was there are ideas where you can actually push it so far, depending on what's going on in the system, where you may not be able to get back. You change it to a point where you can't push it back far enough to get to your top line again. And we actually see that in some systems, some simple relationships, where once you've changed it, it's done. You're not going to be able to change it back the other way. All right, so the other thing I wanted to point out, you know, this comes from the idea that they're complex adaptive systems. I threw this slide in here mainly because this came from Holland in 1975. So we've been looking at complex systems for a long time. We've been studying these things. What we have found in the latest 5-10 years is some of these ideas about tipping points where we actually see them out there. We see some of the other things going on. But what we find out is the more we study on the complex adaptive systems, the more we figure out we really need adaptive management. We find out we need to know more to do what we're going to do. And the other part is we find out that no matter what choice we make as a management option, we're probably not going to be completely right. We're going to be off. We can't have a perfect decision on trying to figure out what the future is going to be. And that's why we do the adaptive management. So I was pretty happy when we went through this with the panel, the invited panel before us. Anka went through this very well. This is again from the Delta Stewardship Council's plan. One of the things I did want to point out was the vetting, Delta Independent Science Board, you know, had glowing report on what they were doing on this stuff. The other thing is the Department of Interior has come out with a new report on how you do adaptive management. We're seeing this stuff in Australia, South Africa. I haven't read through those yet, but now I have some reading to do. Well vetted around the world. It is the way to do it. It's not a perfect system because we're dealing with something that we can't get perfect answers for. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out to try and to do a little value added here is the idea that we really spend a lot of our time talking about this outer loop. We don't really talk too much about what's going on in these processes here. This is another way to look at this, all right? This is the outer loop. We do this pretty well. We don't do it perfectly by any means, but we do this pretty well. This is once we have a frame set up. We have a plan, we have a strategic plan, we have a Delta stewardship plan, we have, in Fish and Game's point of view, we have our plan, ecosystem restoration program, et cetera. Once we have that, then we work in the policy arena trying to reshape that. We have scientists that communicate to the agencies. Agencies have our own scientists, and we work on this stuff within a frame. But every now and then we have to go back out to a larger cycle. That's when we frame it. And that's where we are at with the Water Quality Control Plan update. We're reframing what's up to at this point. For instance, this push to go ahead and base things on a natural flow regime is somewhat of a reframing. Not completely new to what was in the 2006 plan, but enough new that it's kind of a reframing of the issue. You can also even look at the outer band where you're transforming the system. And as an example, it may not be a perfect example, but we had the Delta Reform Act that said we have co-equal goals now. And the co-equal goals is the ecosystem is important and water supply reliability is important. And so we did transform the way we're looking at this process. There's other transforming processes that can happen, and Bruce kind of mentioned these. These might be the ideas when we have to reframe. We flood 4 or 5 islands with an earthquake, or we have a big flood event and it floods, 7 or 8 islands or something like that. We may have to reframe at that point because the system's been transformed. All right. But one of the important things a couple important points about this circle in here, one is you have to frame it in a way that this interior circle, or with our other model, the exterior circle, but the policy cycle can be done well. So you have to give us some pretty good objectives and goals that puts through on this stuff. The more discrete probably the better, but you also have to be able to give us the ability to do a little bit of adaptive management within there. And I think in the past, the past water quality control plans have done pretty well on those, but I think we're still in that point where now we're reframing, we're looking at the new data, we're going to be doing this again. Now the other point that I wanted to make is when they talk about this area out here, they have this word learning. And learning, I think the reason they're throwing this concept in is because it's more social learning. In this area, there is learning, but it's within agencies, it's within the experts. Sometimes it's the stakeholders too, but the state water contractors, the federal water contractors are pretty much experts. It's kind of talking to the same audience. But when we get out into this cycle out here, we're talking much more to the public in general, folks that aren't expertise. And so you need to do a little bit of social learning. And so one of the things I like to always point out when I'm talking about this is that you need multidisciplinary approaches to understanding what's going on. And part of that discipline is communications. And we all know that the more you learn about communication, the more you learn that you need to learn. You figure out that there is more to know all the time. And then I wanted to touch upon climate change just to kind of put it in perspective of where we're at. You can also look at climate change and how we adapt to it under a temporal framework, so short-term, mid-term, and long-term. There's some short-term coping measures that we take, and we are taking. And some of those are the way we operate our systems. Some of the changes we're going to make year to year on looking at our population indexes for our fish, et cetera, and we can do some changes. Then there's more substantial adjustments we do over midterm. That's when we're trying to figure out, okay, maybe we put a couple of pipelines under the delta and we change our point of diversion. And then there's long-term transformations. Well, what happens when the whole delta is the sea level has risen, 2 meters? That's a big change. We are working in this arena and this arena pretty well. We're starting to study this arena. I think one of the things that I look at with climate change, California is a leader on a lot of this, and water issues within California, I think, is part of the big lead. And so there is a tremendous amount of information that's going on. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Energy Commission with DWR and other agencies put out, I think, 70 articles all at the same time on climate change adaptation. A tremendous amount of information that's coming out. A lot of it not completely new, but new ideas and some new framing on the things. So it's stuff that we have to keep up with. It's important for us to understand what the long term is. And the example I was thinking of is earlier on in my career when I worked for the Department of Water Resources, I was part of the Jones Tract response when it flooded. And when it flooded, the decision needed to be made, does the Department of Water Resources just fight and stabilize, or do we pump out and recover the island? And the decision was, at that point, going to be a political decision because the science of what it meant really hadn't been done already. All right. Since then, we have the DREAMS report from the DWR, and we have Jay Lund's reports and other things from Envisioning Futures. Lots of looks. We haven't made decisions as a society, but we have kind of started looking at this stuff. So this longer-term transformation, do we pump out islands in the future? Those sorts of decisions need to be thought about not necessarily decided at this point. But if we don't think about them, when the question happens, we'll be caught flat-footed. So in summary, like I said, this was pretty easy. Delta's a complex system. I don't think that's news. We require adaptive management. It's the best we have, the best way we have of doing it. It's not perfect. Adaptive management model is well accepted because of those issues. Delta ecosystem management is transformed by Delta Reform Act and co-equal goals. Current process is reframing it, and we need the clear objectives to have effective policy cycle within that, so we can get from here to the next time you do the update in 3, 5, or 10 years. And then on climate change, the response is related to a time horizon. We can't do everything right now, but we should be working as much as we can to figure it out. And that's what I've got. Thank you.
Okay, shall we break for lunch? Okay, so what time do you want to come back?
Let's come back at 12:55.
Okay, and just so you know, for the afternoon, the agenda is changed a little bit. The break has been moved to 3:25, which means that we'll go straight from the resource management agencies into the environmental NGO group. So make sure you get your presentations loaded before we start again. All right, thanks.
My chair has no pneumatics to it. I tried raising it up and it went right back down to the bottom.